Hello interwebs, I hope you're all doing well, and for today's video, I actually want to try something a little bit different in terms of the style of video that I'm doing here on my secondary channel, Jessie Gender After Dark, and it might be an ongoing type of a video that I do on the channel going forward, depending on how people like it and what people are thinking about it. Because, for those of you who don't know, this channel that you're currently on right now, Jessie Gender After Dark, is actually my secondary channel, and I have a main channel called Jessie Gender, where I do like big, long video essay type of content, and sort of my main stuff that I put a lot of energy into and editing time and make it look really nice and professional. And then this is the channel where I've been doing basically my review content of like different episodes of TV shows, as well as interviews and things like that I don't think would do as well on my main channel, given that that's sort of like where I put out the stuff that I think will like really boost itself in the algorithm. But I still wanted to do because I still like to have these discussions. But I've also kind of had more thoughts in my brain that I've kind of wanted to open up and just have a conversation about, but that haven't necessarily made themselves into an essay yet. Like, these conversations may end up in an essay one day just because they're rattling in my head, but I wanted to have a place to kind of have a little bit more off-the-cuff casual conversation with all of you about things that I'm thinking when it comes to media and pop culture and all of that stuff. So I might be doing more of these little one-off videos where I have just sort of discussions about things I'm thinking about with media and pop culture. So for my first one of these that I'm going to be doing, I kind of want to talk about something that's been on my mind lately in terms of the tone and type of content that I'm being really drawn to lately within media. About this idea between sort of doomeristic, darker content and more hopeful content. And it's a conversation that I have been kind of having in my brain lately based off of two TV shows that have been kind of put at odds with each other in the media today, The House of the Dragon and The Rings of Power. Both sort of big fantasy prequel series to these big game-changing fantasy franchises, Game of Thrones for one and Lord of the Rings for others. And what's been interesting to me is to see the type of conversation that has come out of these shows airing at the same time. On the one hand, it seems kind of very natural to put these shows at odds with each other because they're both big fantasy series, both prequels, both part of big franchises, both have a big fandoms behind them, both airing at the same time, both like the big premiere shows on both of their streaming services. So there's a lot to compare between the two of them, especially with House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones being itself a sort of critique of Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's work based off of George R.R. Martin's original novels. So there's been clear reason to do so. But I also feel like that putting these two shows in competition with each other, like saying which one's better, I think ultimately does a disservice to both of them. Not just in terms of the culture war conversation, like people are putting these two shows in sort of, battles with each other because like Lord of the Rings is woke and it aired black dwarves or whatever, so it's ruined it by wokeness, and House of the Dragon's better because it's less woke, even though they were complaining about black people being House of the Dragon and that show being woke before they were able to put in antagonist and stuff. Anyways, that's an aside. Not in terms of that culture war conversation, because I think it like comparing these two shows in that sort of like antagonistic way, like which one's better, I think ultimately doesn't allow us to draw some interesting nuanced conversations that does by having them be in conversation with each other. And that's sort of what I want to put out here, because House of the Dragon, I think, is a better written show. If we were just sitting here and being like qualitatively, I would have to say, like, I think House of the Dragon is the show that has the performances are stronger. Like Paddy, the actor who plays Viserys, deserves an Emmy. He was fantastic. I think the writing was a little bit stronger. Performances were really great. But that's not to say that Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power was bad necessarily. It had very frustrating problems. The showrunners of the show were first-time showrunners, not first-time writers necessarily, but it was clear that it was a show written by people who were the first time running a show and were more interested in like mystery box style storytelling and big surprises over like really setting up and paying off satisfactorily good storylines, and it led to a frustrating season overall. But there was some good in Rings of Power as well. I thought the Durin, Elrond, and Disa stuff was phenomenal. I loved that dynamic of like Elrond and Durin being boyfriends, like friend boyfriends, and Disa being like, oh, my husband and his boyfriend are adorable and I'm here for it. Love that stuff. And there were some other good parts here and there, like some of the Southland battle scenes and things like that. I loved Adar, and the sort of orc, like developing of orc motivations and culture was super interesting. So it wasn't a complete wash of a show. So I think like comparing like one is great and one's bad ultimately, like I said, does a disservice to both. But I do feel too that House of the Dragon is the better show on just a quality level. But that being said, having watched both shows now, I do feel like there was something that was drawing me more in terms of my. It's difficult to gauge because like House of the Dragon just intrigued me more as like a writer, and like I think that there was like those sort of things there, but like there was something just on a personal level that was drawing me much more to Lord of the Rings. And I spoke about this in my season review of Lord of the Rings. That is the tone of the shows. When we look at House of the Dragon, it is a show about patriarchy, about the dark side of society. Like the whole idea and concept of Game of Thrones from George R. R. Martin is like, what if you took Tolkien's fantasy world and like but had people act as if they were real like Middle Ages style people there. So you have like people marrying each other inside their own families, people killing each other over perceived slights. This very house dominated, sort of lineage dominated society that's so focused on individual, like creating a lineage for yourself, aggrandizing your own house, wars breaking out over perceived slights, real or imaginary, and just very brutal, and sometimes the darker side of humanity, to the point where like we see really brutal violence and some really dark stuff if you've been watching some of the later episodes of this season. And in many ways, I feel like that is a worthwhile content to a degree. Clearly, I think it's a great show, and I think it allows the show to like really hone in on like how systems of oppression, how patriarchy, how monarchy, how authoritarian systems like this work. And I think that is definitely something to be talking about and discussing. But I also feel like the show kind of has this doomeristic, nihilistic mentality about it that sort of kind of goes like, this stuff exists, and yeah, we're depicting it, and it sucks, but that's just what it is. Like, it's more interested in the depiction of these atrocities than it is in necessarily offering up ways out of it. It's sort of like we're heading into this this sort of like, this is just this battle that we're being built up in House of the Dragon is like, everyone's just gonna be fighting each other, and it's all gonna suck, and everyone's like, a lot of people are gonna die, and there's no good guys or bad guys. It's just all terrible. And that is worthwhile to showcase, like how these systems create that and really just harm everybody. But unlike Game of Thrones, which, putting aside how that show ended, had this sort of like sense of we're heading somewhere at least potentially positive, with like characters like Daenerys wanting to break the wheel, again putting aside how her story ends, and like facing the White Walkers as like clear villains, things like that, like as like a potential metaphor for climate change. Some people have discussed that as a potential way of reading the White Walkers, and there's a way of like, we can beat those things. House of the Dragon feels much more nihilistic because we kind of ultimately know that like the system's going to keep going. You're not going to have a Daenerys Targaryen kind of character, and this isn't a spoiler from the book, but like things are just going to end up shitty for everybody as it goes. And I look at that, and I look at something like Lord of the Rings, which is clearly much more fantastical. There's clearly like good guys and bad guys and things like that. But I also appreciate something that was ingrained very much in Tolkien's writing, and that is hope. Tolkien, he was a very, very kind of subtly religious. He wasn't like C.S. Lewis here, but he was a subtly religious man. And he always sort of infused this like sense of like a greater power, a greater good, or a greater sense of like goodness in the world, and that you could read beyond just a religious context. One of the most famous passages in Lord of the Rings that is personally one of my favorites, I might even want to get tattooed on my body one day, was in Return of the King. There's a moment where Sam is carrying Frodo up to Mount Doom. And he sort of looks up into the sky, and he's fallen down. He thinks he's going to not make it to Mount Doom, and he sees through the fog of Mordor all the smoke and visuals of industry, and he sees these stars, and he realizes that no matter what, no matter how much evil there is in the world, there will always be goodness out there that can remain untouched. There's always something to hope for. There's always goodness out there, even in the darkest of times. There's always something good to look at and look for and push for and fight for, and that's what gives him the power to strive to eventually leading to the defeat of Sauron and getting Frodo to Mount Doom. And that, I feel like that is something that we really need more of today. We live in a very dark time. at the moment. Climate change is very scary. I'm recording this on a day that's in the middle of October, where it is like 80 something degrees in Seattle, which is ridiculous a temperature for Seattle at this time. But that might become more and more the norm. We're seeing climate change really being much more unignorable, I guess is the right, not the right phrase, but you know what I'm saying. And it's getting very scary. Not to mention, different stuff going on with politics. The rising, anti-LGBTQ, fascistic language that is going on around the United States and around the world right now, and it's very dark at times. And I feel like House of the Dragon is a show that sort of like looks at that and is like, yep, that sucks, doesn't it? Whereas shows like Lord of the Rings give me a little bit of hope in this time. And I'm not here to say that one storytelling choice is inherently better than the other. I have issues with both Lord of the Rings and House of the Dragon, actually, but House of the Dragon is a little bit more in that, like, there are things that I see behind the scenes of that show that, like, has me questioning, like, their treatment of LGBTQ characters as a little bit disposable in that show. Some of the, I won't go into it, but some of the quotes that the showrunners had about people of color in the series felt a little bit exoticizing. If you look into that, Princess Weeks, who's a wonderful YouTuber, wrote for the Mary Sue about that, if you're curious about some of the, I'm not going to say, like, oh, I'm not calling the showrunners racist, like, they're awful, but, like, so I'm like, there's definitely a little bit of a blind spot here when you're talking about that sort of stuff in the way they discuss marginalized folks in House of the Dragon. So I have those criticisms with that show. But even beyond that, even if I move beyond that sort of issue, and Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power has that issue to a degree too, though I think less prominently so. But even move beyond that, like, House of the Dragon just has this kind of nihilistic framing, and again, it's not inherently bad. As a kid, I enjoyed those stories too, as like Batman and that sort of thing. But as I've gotten older, I found myself, I've always loved the hopeful stories. That's why I'm a Trekkie. It always inspires me to be better. But as I get older, I find myself, even beyond Star Trek, getting more and more drawn to those types of characters. I used to be a big Batman fan as a kid. Now I am much more of a Superman fan, for example. Someone who gives me hope in these dark times. Not that Batman can't be hopeful, but it's definitely a darker story. Something like Lord of the Rings versus Game of Thrones. Even though I think Lord of the Rings was a worse show, quote unquote, I think I was just drawn to its tone a hell of a lot more, even though I think House of the Dragons is the better series. And I think that that's really necessary in our fiction right now. We need something to, like, hope for the future, because I do feel like, fiction doesn't necessarily, dictate how people feel about the world. I do feel like fiction can sometimes inform how we think about marginalized folks, for example, especially if people don't encounter or don't think they encounter certain marginalized folks, so they're encountering them in fiction is going to inform how people view marginalized people. So, like, the depiction of trans people, for example, in fiction can sometimes inform real life, feelings about trans people, because a lot of people only encounter trans people in fiction sometimes. So there's that element of it. But I think on a general rule, I feel like fiction is ultimately more reflective of our cultural values than in terms of dictating our cultural values. And I feel like when we have a cultural sense of nihilism, that ultimately leads to these more, darker shows, but also, like, the nihilistic mindset in our culture leads to more darker political movements. Like, a lot of fascism, like sort of growing fascistic movements, are built on a lot of young men, mostly, but not always, not only young men, though predominantly, I think, young white men, feeling like they don't have any hope. Like, they're sort of, like, nihilistic and sort of the sense of doomerism. FD Signifier, wonderful video essayist, if you haven't heard of him, did a video about that. The sort of manosphere video they did was great. And how, like, that sense of doomerism ultimately does sort of lead people down a path of, like, well, fuck it, let's sort of, like, let's control this, let's take our own power, we have to live up to this ideal of a strong man. It's the only way to find meaning in the world. And I really feel like if you give people a sense of hope in the future, you can draw out a sense of community, of caring for each other, of working together in a way that I think is a much better way to build society and a much better outlook on the world, and allows us to make the world better, to fight back against things like climate change and fascistic movements. And again, this is not like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones fault by any means, but I think that the two shows being next to each other sort of made me reflect on this feeling of what I want out of my fiction lately. And it's not to say that I don't like House of the Dragon. I think it's great. It deserves a lot of Emmys, for sure, for a lot of different reasons. But I also feel like, I feel like we need more shows like Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. Hopefully less, issues with its writing. But, like, totally, I feel like we need more of that in our world today. Just shows that inspire us, push us forward. It's why I love Star Trek so much, It's why I'm so excited to watch the Star Trek show, because I know I'm going to come out of it, whether it be through the series arc or an episode's arc, feeling hopeful about the future, And I feel like we just need more of that in our fictions. So that's something I just wanted to discuss with all of you. Like I said, this might end up being a video essay at some point, or make itself into a video essay as part of one. But it's just something that was on my mind, and so I wanted to have a discussion with all of you. What do you think, though? Do you agree with me, disagree with me? I'd love to hear all your thoughts below. Did you like this type of video content? Do you like me just rambling about thoughts that I'm having about fiction and stuff in general? Like I said, I can't promise it'll be every week and things like that, but every once in a while, I think I might just pop on and just discuss and ramble at you with things that I'm feeling. So let me know if you like that in the comments below. Beyond all that, I hope you all, my friends, as always, live long and prosper.